Right.
So this week's Torah portion is the last Torah portion of the book of Genesis, Vayechi, and it's Vayechi. And it continues with Jacob and his oldest children have moved and settled in Egypt because that's where the food is, if you recall. That's where the economy is better. And that's where their son Joseph is the viceroy of Egypt. And it's very interesting that Parshas Vayechi means, and he lived. Who lived? Vayechi, who lived, Margaret? Do you remember who lived? Who was it talking about?
God, my mind is blank.
I'm sorry. It's fine. It's not a trick question.
No.
Jacob lived in the land of Egypt. So Vayechi, Yaakov, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years once he was reunited with his son Joseph. And now he's 147 years, old. And he realizes that the end of his life is near. He's dying. So he decides to call all his children together and give each one all of them a communal blessing, and then give each child a separate blessing. And he starts off with his son Joseph, his beloved son Joseph. And he tells him, promise me that when I die, you will bury me not here in Egypt. You'll bury me in the land of Israel. Where? In Ma'orat HaMachpelah, where the other matriarchs and patriarchs are buried. So remember, Adam and Chava are buried there, even though they're not matriarchs and patriarchs, Adam and Eve. Abraham and Sarah were buried there. Isaac and Rivka were buried there. And now Jacob is going to be buried there together with his first wife, Leah. Where was Rachel buried? His second wife, his beloved wife.
Right. And somewhere else, but near Bethlehem.
Yeah, Beis Lechem. It's called Keva Rachel, the grave of Rachel, the burial place of Rachel. She's not buried with her beloved husband.
Now,
interesting.
Why?
Why? Do you know why?
No, I forgot. I know you told us. No, I forgot. I'm sorry.
That's okay. You don't have to be sorry. So he tells Joseph, my son, promise me you'll bury me in the land of Israel. And his son Joseph promises him. And it's a very cryptic thing because as he's discussing his burial, he says the following to his son. And as for me, when I came from Padam Aram, he's telling his son Joseph, when your mother and I and Leah and all of you left Padam Aram, remember Jacob married Leah and Rachel, Zilpah and Bilhah. He had the 12 tribes. He had the daughter Dinah. They left Padam Aram and they traveled back to Israel. They met up with Esau. Remember that whole story, right? And Rachel died because she took the idols from her father, and Jacob said, whoever took those idols will not live long. So he says, and when we came from Padam Aram, Rachel died a lie. She died on me in the land of Canaan on the way when there was still some way to come to Ephrat, and I buried her there, he says. And what's Ephrat? Beit Lechem. So the question everyone asks, he's talking to Joseph about end of days. I'm passing away. I want to give you a blessing. Bring your sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Joseph had 2 sons. Bring them to me for a blessing. I'm going to bless them with an inheritance. And then he switches gears and says, and you know, when we left Padam Aram, your mother Rachel died, and I buried her there in Beit Lechem. So the question is, what does this have to do with it? Why bring up the pain of Joseph losing his mother at such a young age? Why bring it up now? He was 9 years old when his mother died. So why would Yaakov now bring it up? What do you think, Margaret? Any insight?
He also mentioned his sons, his grandsons.
Right.
Were they about the same age? 9 or whatever? No. That maybe the grandson should remember it also.
Okay, possibly. He wants the grandchildren to hear the story. But remember how we discussed last week how it wasn't enough that Joseph made peace with what happened to him. He worked it out. He worked out what his brothers did to him. So he was in a good place when he met up with his brothers. Why could he forgive them? Why didn't he take revenge on them? Why was he able to say to them, you didn't send me, you didn't sell me, I was sent here by God? In other words, he was in a place where he could rise above the anger and resentment that normal people would have for what was done to him.
Right.
So the same thing here, the Torah is telling us that Yaakov was about to die. It was not discussed, he never discussed with his son then why he wouldn't bury his beloved wife Rachel, the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. Why didn't he bury her in the cave of Machpelah with the other matriarchs and patriarchs? She deserved it. He never confronted the issue with his son. So he didn't want to die and leave an open wound where Joseph might be thinking, why did my father do that? My brother sold me. My father buried my mother away from everyone else. My whole family is jaded here. There must be some prejudice. He never confronted it. He never discussed it. So before he dies, he wants to explain to Joseph what happened. So the commentaries ask, what did happen? How come she was buried in Beit Lechem, on the outskirts of Israel, in Israel, but on the edge, not in Ma'oret HaMachpelah in Hebron? Why did he do that? So the commentaries say, it says she died. He said, Mei Salai, she died on me. What does it mean she died on me? And the Sepharnis says that when a wife dies, the grief is so great. When a spouse dies, the grief is so great. She died on me. The pain I felt, the horror of her sudden death caused me such angst. I was almost, he said, paralyzed. I couldn't just travel another day and a half and go bury her in Ma'arsa Machpelah. The grief didn't allow me to kind of move, put one foot in front of the other. When something like that happens, a tragedy doesn't let you think clearly, so to speak. So that's the Sepharna, one of the commentaries. The Ramban says a different reason. He's telling his son, it's not like I was traveling myself with a backpack and your mother died. My wife, Rachel, your mother died. And then a half a day later, we bring her to Ma'arsa Machpelah and we bury her. He says, I was traveling with hundreds of people, all my children, all my spouses, all my servants, all my cattle, all my possessions. A journey of a half a day from where we were in the area of Beit Lechem wouldn't take a half a day with such a large entourage. It would take 4 or 5 days.
And you have to bury her right away, right?
And he said, and then he says also, Ramban, and I didn't even have embalming material to preserve the body. Think of the heat. What would happen to the body in those 4, 5, 6 days while we were traveling? So Ramban says, he's telling his son, it was physically impossible to bury her in Ma'arsa Machpelah. That's what he says. Okay. So there's 2 reasons. We could kind of accept these reasons, right? But Rashi, by the way, who usually gives the most practical reason, is the one who gives us the real insight to what happened. So I want to share with you this Rashi, because this Rashi explains what really happened on a deeper level. So Rashi says like this. I'm going to bring up the Rashi. Give me a second. This is what Rashi says. And he quotes from the book of Jeremiah, the book of the prophets. And there I buried her. I did not carry her just to Beit Lechem, to bring her into the land of Israel. And I know, he says to his son, that you may have a complaint against me in your heart. Why didn't I bury there? But by the word of God, Jacob says, I had a divine prophecy from God. God spoke to me and said, bury her there in Beit Lechem. Why? That she might be of aid to her children. When Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Romans, exiled them, and they passed by Beit Lechem, there would Rachel come out crying, and they would come out crying to her grave and saying, help us, help us. And what would she say? It is stated, a voice in Ramah, which is Beit Lechem, is heard. And the Holy One, blessed be, answers her, there is a reward for thy work, said the Lord, and thy children shall return to their border. So let me clarify this Rashi in plain words.
Yes.
So Yaakov says to Yosef, there's a much deeper reason why I didn't bury your mother in Ma'aretz HaMachpelah. I was told by God to bury her in this specific place, Beit Lechem, Cave of Rachel. Why? And Rashi says, why? Why would God tell him to bury her on the outskirts of Israel, in Israel, but on the outer edge? Because God knew there would be a time that the Jewish people would be exiled from the land of Israel. Remember, the Romans came, Nebuchadnezzar. They destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash. They took all the Jews who they didn't slaughter, rape, and kill, like Hamas. They took them in chains, and they marched them out of Israel to be slaves in Rome. And where did they pass on their way out? Their mother, the matriarch Rachel's grave site. And they began to cry when they passed. As they were led out of Israel, they cried, they wailed, help us, help us. And Rachel called out to God and said, what are you doing to my children? Even though they sinned, she says to Almighty God, you must help them. So God, a voice comes out from God, I will return them to their borders, I will return them back home. Now remember, Rachel is crying for Jews who sinned against God. Why was there a destruction of the temple? They began worshiping idolatry. They began acting with promiscuity. They began giving up on the Torah and the mitzvahs and assimilating into Roman culture. So they were punished. Yet Rachel says, I don't care if my child is rebellious. I don't care if my child transgressed. These are my children. And she called out to God, and God responded and said, don't worry, they will be returned. So Rachel, to her own, and maybe in own detriment, she's not buried with her husband. She's not buried with her sister. She's not buried with the other matriarchs and patriarchs. Not as a punishment, but rather she sacrifices herself to be buried elsewhere so she could be a support system for her children and all future generations. So what Jacob is really telling his son Joseph, look at who your mother was. Your mother was something extraordinary. Look throughout her life, by the way, she's a woman of self-sacrifice. When she knows that Leah will be embarrassed because Jacob knew that his father-in-law was going to try to switch the girls. So he gave Rachel certain signs for the wedding ceremony. Remember the story? He gives Rachel signs. When I come to the canopy, the chuppah, make sure you give me these signs. I'll know it's you, because she was covered over, as was the tradition. So she felt bad for Leah, her older sister. She gave her the sign. So that's why Yaakov didn't know he was marrying Leah. She could have said, no, he loves me. He wants to marry me. He met me at the well. He gave me the jewelry. I should be married to him. You'll find your bashert. You'll find your husband in the right time. She didn't do that. So we see Rachel throughout her life sacrifices. And when she dies, she's buried in Beit Lechem. Also, it's a sacrifice on her part. She's not buried in the very prestigious part of Israel, Hebron, where all the matriarchs and patriarchs, that's the place to be. You know, it's like a woman went to her lawyer to write up her will. She says, I want to be cremated, she says to lawyer, and make sure that my daughter spread the ashes in the largest mall in America. The lawyer says, why? Why in the largest mall in America? She says, there I know my daughters will go. So Rachel, Yaakov is telling Yosef, now you know who your mother really was. Now you understand who your mother truly is and truly was. And the story that Jeremiah, the prophet, when he tells the Jewish people, in the book of Jeremiah, he relates the story of Rachel. What happened was when the matriarchs and patriarchs and Moses saw what was happening to the Jewish people under Nebuchadnezzar, he was raping and killing. They said the blood of the Jews ran in the streets like a river. That's how much blood there was, like the Hamas story. The atrocities. They cried. Abraham came to God. How could you do this to my children? What are you doing? God didn't answer. Moses came and said, God, I'm Moses. Remember me? How could you do this to your children? God didn't answer. Rachel called out. Rachel mevachel baneha, as it's quoted in Jeremiah. She calls out. She says, God, how could you do this to your children? How could you do this? You're jealous? You're jealous of idols that they worshiped idolatry? Shouldn't I be jealous of my sister who married my husband first, my beloved husband? If I wasn't jealous, why are you jealous? You can't handle it? No. She called out. And I want to read you her words because they're so poetic and so beautiful. And when she called out, God said, thus said God, a cry is heard in Ramah. That's where she's buried. Wailing, bitter, weeping. Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. She's crying now to God. God finally responds, not to Moses, not to Abraham, not to Jacob, not to Joseph. Who does he respond to? Rachel. He says to Rachel, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is a reward for your labor, declares God. They shall return from the enemy's land, and there is hope for the future, declares God. Your children shall return to their country. The only one God responds to during this crisis is to Rachel. How do we know the story happened? None of them are alive. It's a conversation between the souls of these great people. But Jeremiah, the prophet, quotes it in the book of Jeremiah. That's how we know the story. That's how we know that it happened. Jeremiah, the prophet, because he's calling out to the people. He said, repent. Look what's going to happen to you. So is Rachel, the mama Rachel, cries for her people. You know, by the 6-day war, there was a rabbi, they went to pray by Cave of Rachel. During the war, you couldn't go there because it was occupied the Jordanians. You couldn't go to Beit Lechem. You would be killed. Finally, when the Jewish army, IDF, freed Beit Lechem, Jews went to pray there. They had been held back from going there for months and months and months. So this rabbi went there and he said, Mama Rachel, I know it's written to dry your tears, stop weeping, but I want to tell you, Mama Rachel, please continue crying for us. We need you. Keep crying. Don't give up on your tears. We need you, Mama Rachel. We need you, Mama Rachel. So now we have a whole beautiful perspective of who Rachel is, who her inner strength, her inner strength of who she truly was. Now, it's one other commentary says, why did Yaakov tell his son the story now? Because he didn't want his son to take revenge. You didn't bury my mother there in the Ma'arat HaMachpelah. I'm not going to bury you. But we don't agree with that because Joseph, knowing his character, would he ever take revenge on his father? He knew his father was a great, great, great sage, scholar, patriarch. And Joseph, his character, his level of forgiveness. And of course, we know that he can't say that maybe he was going to take revenge on his father, and that's why his father is telling him the story. We don't agree with that perhaps that opinion or thought that, you know why Jacob is telling his son, maybe he's going to take it out on me. You didn't bury my mother, now I'm not going to bury you. I'm not going to fulfill your promise. By the way, the Torah portion ends 110 years old. Joseph dies, and he makes his children promise that they're going to bury him in Israel. But they don't bury him in Israel. You know when they bury him in Israel? After the Jews leave Egypt. Years later, hundreds of years later. They don't immediately bury him in Israel. You know why? Because Joseph is like the captain who stays with his ship. He doesn't leave Egypt till his people leave Egypt. So he's buried initially in Egypt. Remember, we discussed last week how the Egyptians loved him. They lauded him. He was a celebrity in Egypt. So they actually buried him in the Nile River. They put him in a metal coffin and they sunk it in the Nile River. And no one knew where he was buried, actually. And like I said last week, the story, Moses knew that when he left Egypt with the Jews, he had to take Yosef. There was a promise. He couldn't find it. So remember the story, Asher's daughter, Sarah, the one with the harp, how she sang to her grandfather, Joseph is alive. She was 200 years old. She knew where Joseph was buried because she was alive. She was alive when it happened. So she sees Moses walking. She says, Moses, our leader, what's going on? He says, I'm looking for Joseph's burial. She goes, he's in the Nile River. But how do you get him out of the Nile River? You don't have the submarine equipment.
Oh, yeah.
So Moses wrote on a piece of paper words of God, like rise, rise, ox. Joseph was called the ox. And his coffin, literally like a science fiction show, rose up from the Nile River. And they were able to take him to the land of Israel. And he was buried in Israel, in Joseph's tomb. And remember in Shechem, and remember when Israel left Gaza, what did they do to that spot? They desecrated his burial place, because that's what they do. When you give them land, you give them territory, they don't keep the holy places sacred, they desecrate. And you can't go to Joseph's tomb now. You can't go there. It's dangerous. It's very, very dangerous. As a matter of fact, when the Jews came to the Red Sea, it didn't split. Remember the story? They come to the Red Sea, it's supposed to split. The Red Sea said to God, I don't want to split.
No.
God said, why not? I told you, when I created you, there'll be a time you're going to have to go against your nature and split for the Jews to cross. So the Red Sea says, I don't recognize these Jews. They're troublemakers. They complain. They're always complaining. They're complaining right now. Why did you take us out of Egypt? We want to go back. Now we're going to drown in the river. Moses, what are you doing to us? They refused to split. So Moses tells the Jewish people, where is Joseph's coffin? Bring it here. And they put Joseph's coffin in front of the whole line. And when the Red Sea saw the coffin of Joseph, it split.
Never heard of that.
It's a beautiful medrash. So say, why did the sea suddenly split for Joseph? Didn't want to split for Moses, didn't want to split for God, because they saw, now we recognize the Jewish nation. This is what they're like. The Josephs, but Joseph will split. A man like Joseph, a Jew like Joseph, even though he was a viceroy of Egypt, he kept true to God, to his people, to his faith. He didn't have an affair with Potiphar's wife when he could have. He didn't give up on his belief in God, even though, why wouldn't he? A 17-year-old sold into slavery by his brothers. Why didn't he rebel against his family? Such a person, such a Jew, for just Jew will split, as we see, and is split. So Joseph is like his mother. The energy, the leadership of Joseph, and also Rachel, who did he think he inherited it from? His mother, right? This is who the sea splits for, a person like Joseph. He says, now I see a Jew I want to split for. Those troublemakers, no thank you. Those complainers, no thank you. For Joseph, I'm going to split. one more beautiful point I want to share with you is when Jacob dies, his sons are petrified. Why are they petrified, Margaret? What do you think?
Because they would fight against each other, or there's no
What are
one.
they thinking about their brother?
Oh, now maybe Joseph will take advantage of them.
Exactly. Now Joseph is going to say, before I didn't want to do anything to my brothers. My father was alive. Why give him aggravation? Now my father is gone. Perfect time to take revenge. You know, some people, they wait to take revenge at the right moment. So I want to read what happened because it's so unbelievable. What happens is the brothers come to him and they express their fear. He says to them from the pasuk, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of so many lives. Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and he spoke kindly to them. This is the second time he says it to them, because earlier also they were scared. They were said, "Oh my gosh, he's going to get us." When they first meet him, what does he say there? "I am your brother Joseph, the one who sold you, the one you sold into Egypt. But don't be distressed and do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there'll be no plowing and reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." And then he says the final words. "So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. I was not sold, as we said last week, I was sent." He reassures them because they're scared. He's going to kill them now, which is so interesting because what you see in Joseph, I become such a fan of Joseph, is that he raises himself to a level of behavior that you can't even believe it. The way he makes peace with what happens to him, the way he lets go of the anger and resentment. All of us should even have 0.25% of that. How we're always angry and resentful. He did this, she said that. I'm never talking to her again. When I see him, I'm going to walk the other way, right? Yosef, that he rises such a level of in his personality that is able to forgive and forget like that, is something spectacular. And that's why, as I just want to repeat this, that's why last week when we discussed this, that's why he's able to help his brothers heal. You can't help someone else heal when you're in a very bad place. If you're angry, depressed, and resentful, how could you help someone else who's angry and who has a guilt and pain and so on? He's only able to help his brothers heal because he's in a very good place. So he knows that everything is divine providence. He realized his whole life is run by divine providence. And it's interesting to know that when many times we have failures, what we perceive as failures are really successes. You know, when the Beatles went to audition for the record label, they said to the Beatles, the record label people said, "Listen, you will not amount to anything. I could tell you right now." The Beatles, who was as great as the Beatles? I remember they came to New York. My mother and father were showing me on television. I was a little girl, but they came to the Ed Sullivan Show, which was the biggest thing, right? And girls were fainting when they saw the Beatles. Oh yeah, and they fainted and and the Beatles became like the greatest sensation. But the record label said, "That you're never going to amount to anything."
They lost their chance. Yeah.
And Steve Jobs, I mean, I know he was adopted by Lebanese parents, but he said there were 3 failures in my life that created my greatest successor. I dropped out of university, he says. I wrote it down. Hold on. He dropped out of university. He got fired from Apple, And then he was diagnosed, unfortunately, with a serious pancreatic cancer. And yet, Steve Jobs, I mean, one of the biggest success stories, the way the millions and billions that he accumulated, building up Apple to what it is today. So bringing this back to Joseph, that sometimes it's precisely what we think is our failures that are really our success. Like Winston Churchill wrote, what's success? It's the ability to go from one failure to another with no loss of enthusiasm. So this is what sustained Joseph, where he's able to tell his brothers, you did not sell me, I was sent here. That is the underlying theme of his success, where he always knows that it is God who sent him, and he was not sold. He was meant to be in this place at this time. And looking again, you cannot say it was easy. It's not easy. And the same thing with his mother, Rachel. God said to her husband, Jacob, to the patriarch Jacob, bury your wife here. She has to be buried. This is her place. This is where she has to be. Why? For her children, for all generations. And we all go there when we go to Israel. Who doesn't go to Cave Rachel? How could you not go to Cave Rachel, Mama Rachel? People go there to pray for children and for health and for prosperity. People go there with all their problems. There's even a myth. I don't know if it's true. People take a red thread, they wear it, they go around 7 times. There's so many interesting little superstitions people have. But who is to contradict that? If somebody wants to wear a red thread from Cave Rachel, go ahead. They even sell it there. Another little business on the side. So Rachel is one of my favorite matriarchs when I think about her, because she's the quintessential Yiddish mama. If you want to know what a true Jewish mother is, that even when a child is rebellious, even when a child drifts away, you are there for them. I want to share a story that happened with this Rabbi Chaim Winterson from Australia, Sydney, Australia. He runs a crisis center for Jewish teenagers and people who will go through crisis, addictions, and people who give up on their Judaism, on their Yiddishkeit. So a family called him for help. They said, you have to help us. Our daughter got married, and she was not happy in the marriage. The marriage got worse and worse, and she asked her husband for a divorce, and he said no, and she disappeared. She ran away, and we don't know where she is, and we don't know what happened to her. We need your help, Rabbi Winterson. So he says to himself, I don't know how I'm going to find her. Australia is huge. She could go on anywhere. So he was going into New York, and he went to the Rebbe. He decided to ask the Rebbe. So he goes to get $1, and he tells the Rebbe the story that a family came to him in Australia. And he tells the Rebbe the story, and she disappeared. This young married lady disappeared. So the Rebbe says, maybe on your way back to Australia, go to Brisbane. He doesn't ask why. The Rebbe tells him to go to Brisbane. He goes to Brisbane. Brisbane was not near Sydney, so he had to take a special plane. He's on the plane. He's sitting near a woman, and they begin chatting. She tells him she's a Greek Orthodox religion. She follows the Greek Orthodox. And the way she was dressed, and it seemed like she was very wealthy. And she told him, yes, she owns a whole chain of dress shops all over Australia. Very wealthy businesswoman. Good. A little later, she asks him, Rabbi, you're a rabbi, right? He says, yeah. Rabbi, I want to ask you a question. In your religion, if someone drifts away from your religion, someone gives up on Judaism, are they lost? Are they forgotten? Can they ever come back? Can they repent? He said, of course, that's the foundation of our Bible. If somebody drifts away for whatever reason, they can always come back home. They can always repent. She says, look, listen, maybe you could help me. There's a girl who works in one of my dress shops in, I think it's called Kales or something with a C in Australia, a little city. And I know she was born Jewish. Not that she acts Jewish. I just know she was born Jewish and she's miserable. She's so unhappy. And I picked up, and then I think she's unhappy is because she needs to go back to who she is. And he can't believe this, what's going on. He's telling her a story about a girl that works for him. He's like, what? He's thinking to himself. So he takes down the address of the store, and he realizes this is all happening divine providence. The Rebbe sent him to Brisbane, and he drives down to this city, the suburb, and he goes to the shop, and he spots the girl. He asks her who she is, and she was from this religious Hasidic family, but she's now doesn't look anything. She looks like a regular Australian secular girl. And he begins chatting her, and he tells her, your parents are looking for you. She says, I can't talk to you. I'm working. He says, no, talk to me. She says, I'll talk to you later. They make a meeting, and she says, listen, Rabbi, I need to be divorced from this man. If you can promise me a divorce, I'll come back home. If you can't promise me a divorce, I'm staying here. So he quickly calls the parents. The parents arrange for a religious divorce and a civil divorce. The husband agrees to get divorced. And now she's divorced. She's willing to come back, sign the papers, and come back home. And she comes back home. And years later, he finds out that she became religious again, got married again, and she has 6 children. All divine providence. All divine providence. So you never know. You're sent to a place, you go to a place, you have a place, you don't know what's going on with the place, you sit near a passenger, you wonder, what's going on in my life? Always know you are sent. You're not sold, you're sent. And when a person is open to divine providence, and they're open to knowing that everything is divine providence, everything takes on a new dimension. You sometimes wonder why were you late? Why were you early? Why was your flight canceled? Why didn't your guest show up? Why did you were supposed to go and now you can't go? Why did you get sick? Why did you lose this money in the stock market? Every day we are coming up with challenges, questions, and know that it's always divine providence. Which doesn't mean you should sit on a chair and say, it's all divine providence. What be will be. We have to be proactive in our lives, but we know that everything that happens to us is God meant it to happen. Why? We don't always know. Sometimes the answer comes much later. Sometimes the answer never comes. We're lucky if we figure it out, but know that life is not random. Life is not a coincidence. It doesn't just happen because it happened. And the end off, when Moshe goes to find that little lost sheep, and he sees the burning bush, he takes off his shoes, and God begins telling him that he's now going to be the leader and take out the Jews. He says, excuse me, what's your name? Almighty One, what's your name? And God says, Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. I am who I am. But the commentary says, not only I am who I am, what will be is what will be. In other words, God is telling Moshe that when the Jewish people are ready for freedom, when you're taking them out of slavery, taking out of bondage, what does it mean, freedom? Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. What will be, will be. In other words, no one can predict your future. No one can prophesy and say, Margaret, you're destined for this, you're destined for that, and then you're paralyzed by your destiny that you were told. Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. Freedom, being created in God's image. And God says what will be means we have to be proactive in our destiny, proactive in what has to be in our lives. And then everything falls into place. And that's why it says on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, when you pray, it says there will be those that will be killed by fire. Remember, the Nesanatok of those will be killed by sword. But tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, ma'avir nesrei hagazera. But charity, repentance, and prayer can avert the disaster, which means what? That even when you're destined to fall off a cliff, you can change your destiny. Eheyeh asher eheyeh. We are in control. We have the freedom to choose what's right. And everything will fall into place. Because at the end of the day, we will have the divine providence in a positive thing, in a positive way. So we have the freedom to choose, and we also have to have an attitude of faith and divine providence. And with those two things, it's a win-win situation. You're in control of yourself. No one can sell you. You are sent, not sold. So with that in mind, we'll finish off, and wish you a wonderful Shabbos, and we should have peace in the land of Israel.